Hey guys, the topic of today's video is leftism is not relative. You hear people making this mistake all the time. They think that first wave feminism, maybe had some valid points or some valid objectives, and it just kind of went off the rails at some point with second and third wave feminism. But no, they're all leftists. They're all unreasonable. It always started out as employing the feminine means of coercion, nagging, shaming, scolding, etc., to obtain things that they aren't willing to pay full price for. And the full price for the franchise primarily is that you're willing to fight. That's full price. And we had universal male franchise, we had conscription. Those two things go hand in hand. Women get the franchise without the conscription, so they're getting something for nothing. And I've explained all this before, but basically, they're getting something without paying the logical price for it, or without doing the corresponding logical duty for it, or without assuming the corresponding logical responsibility for it. And so it's parasitic to make that demand and to try and obtain that demand by employing these kind of feminine strategies of nagging and shaming and rallying and scolding and psychoanalysis and mockery and ridicule and gossip and all these techniques that they use to advance feminist causes and to demand feminist policies or programs or agendas. Anyway, so feminism always been leftist. It's not relative. Just because they've had the franchise for 100 years doesn't make it conservative or right-wing, although a lot of so-called conservatives or right-wingers are not going to challenge women's suffrage because it is a little bit traditional at this point, but it's still leftist. It was always leftist. It always will be leftist. Leftism is not relative. Leftism is everything that is parasitic and dysgenic and unproductive and dysfunctional and dysgenic and degenerate and degrading and defective, right? That's what leftism is. And so feminism was always leftist. Stuff doesn't stop becoming leftist just because it's been in effect for a while. Now, there are things that can go back and forth between being leftist and being not leftist depending on circumstances or conditions. Let's say Christianity started out pretty leftist, right? All this meek inherit the earth stuff, and spreading through women and slaves and underclasses. Started out pretty leftist. It was basically the social justice of the ancient world. After a certain period of time, it had to do some things that were not leftist in order to spread and survive, and so there are some aspects of Christianity that are not leftist, that are truly productive and beneficial, and sometimes unintentionally so. And one example of this may be like the Christian suppression of inbreeding and the promotion of outbreeding. So from the 9th to 12th centuries, canon law extended the initial, the traditional historical Western prohibition on inbreeding within 4 generations. That's measured to the common ancestor and back. So, a first cousin would be out of bounds because it's 2 generations back to the grandfather and then 2 generations back to the cousin. So, within 4 generations is no good. Second cousin's fine. First cousin's out of bounds. I think that was how that worked. But from the 9th to the 12th centuries, the church enforced a much stricter requirement of 7 generations to the common ancestor, but not back. So basically, if there's any relation within recorded history between you and this other person, they're out of bounds for marriage purposes. And I suppose the rationale of this was probably to break up family estates and to put more land on the market so that the church could acquire it. So fundamentally kind of a parasitic and self-serving motivation, which makes it a little bit leftist. But one of the and it's definitely leftist because it's using it's moralizing, using a moral narrative or a moral imperative to obtain some material end. But had some non-leftist consequences, and one of which was to create homogenous, outbred nations. So by mixing up the tribes and mixing up the clans within European nations, you get homogenous, outbred nations, and people's in-groups get much larger to include, the whole nation effectively. And so you get these homogenous, outbred nations that are able to universalize kinship trust, within their nation, because everyone in the nation now, instead of a bunch of reproductively isolated tribes and clans, they're intermarrying. And so everybody within the nation is, not necessarily close kin, but distant kin, fifth cousins or sixth cousins or fourth cousins or something like that. And so you can universalize kinship trust because there is a reasonable degree of kinship there that exists. And a much larger in-group, expanding the sphere for cooperation and division of labor and all sorts of productive things that ultimately propelled European nations to, to greatness and world dominance. The downside of that, of course, is if you continue this push for outbreeding and universalism, much beyond the level of the nation, then you start extending this trust and this altruism and these in-group privileges and benefits to to people who don't reciprocate them, who are not just not close kin, but aren't kin at all, and as a matter of fact are still adhering to these tribalistic inbreeding reproductive strategies that do create tight-knit clans and tribes which are loyal to each other within that group, within that clan or that tribe. They're loyal to each other individually, but they're not going to reciprocate that loyalty outside of those units, outside of those groups to you. And so they're going to remain distinct from your universalist. They're not going to become part of your homogenous outbred society. They're going to become a parasitic enclave within it, a non-reciprocal enclave that takes the benefits and enjoys the altruism and the trust that you extend to them, but don't extend the same to you. So, there's a limit beyond which, this policy, which kind of started out leftist because it was a little bit parasitic and self-serving, it was using a false narrative, it was using a moral imperative and moralizing to, seek after some material benefit for the church, had some non-leftist consequences. It had some productive and beneficial consequences for nations, and to that extent we could say it's non-leftist, but once you push it beyond the scale of a nation, then it becomes leftist again, because it is parasitic, it is destructive, it is degenerative, it is consumptive. These are the hallmarks of leftism, right? Anything that's dishonest and parasitic and consumptive and destructive is leftism. It's not relative. It doesn't matter how much time has elapsed, how long this policy has been in effect. It's either leftism or it's not leftism. And just like with something like, extending the franchise to women, it's been 100 years, that doesn't make it not leftism. These prohibitions on inbreeding started out a little bit leftist, ended up being not totally leftist, and then went back to being leftist again once you exceeded the limits on the other side, once you got beyond the scale where it's not leftist. So it did change from leftism to non-leftism to leftism, but that's not a function of how much time has elapsed or how long it's been in effect. It's a function of there are these limits within which this thing works, and it produces these beneficial effects, these productive effects. And over here on this side of the limits, it doesn't work and doesn't produce the beneficial effects, so it's parasitic and destructive. And over here outside the limits, it doesn't work and produce beneficial or productive effects, so it's also parasitic and destructive. But within these limits, it can work and it can produce beneficial and productive effects. And so maybe within those limits it's not leftist, but it started out over here and it was leftist, and then it evolved through this area between these limits where it's not leftist and into this other area over here where it's leftist again, not a function of time or how long it's been in effect, but just a function of those limits and whether it's within them or outside of them. So if something is going to evolve from being leftist to not being leftist, or from not being leftist to being leftist, that's the process by which it evolves, and it's all in reference to the circumstances and the conditions that are prevailing. It's not a function of time. And there are a lot of leftist things that have been done, giving women the franchise, or, just talking about universal or inalienable or natural rights. That's pretty leftist, because you're not specifying the limits, within which it's productive to protect those kind of rights or grant those kind of rights. You're not specifying the conditions that have to be satisfied for the granting of those kind of rights to be productive or beneficial. You're not specifying the qualifications that are necessary. You're just saying, oh, well, it's universal, they're natural rights, they're inalienable rights. That's a false narrative, first of all, which makes it leftist. It's parasitic, which makes it leftist, because you're allowing people to get something for nothing. You're not specifying what they have to give, what they have to do, what responsibilities and duties and obligations they have to fulfill in order to make those rights productive and therefore profitable and therefore sustainable. That's been for 400 years we've been talking about rights in this way, which is a leftist way of talking about rights. And it doesn't become not leftist just because we've been doing it for a number of centuries. So, that's something we're going to have to reevaluate and take a hard look at, along with a lot of other things. There's a lot of leftist things that are now traditional, which allows them to be taken up by conservatives and self-styled right-wingers. But that doesn't mean they're right-wing. It doesn't mean they're not leftist, because leftism is not relative. Leftism is a fairly specific, at least in my mind, has a fairly specific meaning. It's everything that's dishonest, fraudulent, parasitic, destructive, degenerative, consumptive. That's what leftism is. And it's not relative. Some things can evolve a little bit from leftism to non-leftism, or from non-leftism to leftism. That's more a function of limits. Within certain limits, it may be beneficial and productive. Outside of those limits, it may not be. It's not a function of how long it's been in effect. So, I'm going to stop there for now. I did upload another video that I've had for like a year that I never uploaded to my channel. I think it's a pretty good video, and I uploaded it privately because, the original reason that I didn't upload it was I thought it was a little bit too edgy for my channel. But I did upload it privately, and it's available on my Patreon. The link is for my patrons. There's no lower threshold or anything, so even $1 a month will get you that link. And I definitely think you'll find it worth your while. And hope to see you over there. Links in the description.